It's so nice to see out-of-town visitors. Gene, I haven't been here for a while. I don't think I saw you since the wedding. Is that right? Was that the last time you were here?
The wedding was
So, anyway. And Aaron and Alice, I was just asking about you a few days ago. So, anyway, so this is going to be part 2 of our historical discussion about David. So we're going to kind of dive right into, because in the review, I'm going to hit quite a few things that I didn't talk about last week, but I think it helps put some things in perspective. So we're going to get right into it. Let's take it to the Lord here. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this time together. Thank you for the opportunity to share your word, in this case, to discuss the history and hopefully make the Bible come alive for all of us. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so today we'll do kind of our normal review of last week, but I'm going to get into quite a few other things. There's a lot of stuff with David, so I'm going to flash through a lot of stuff. I've got reference. Anybody wants a copy of the slides, you can look at it. You can look things up. There's just a lot of, it's such a fascinating time of history to study. And there's, I think I would mention this last week, David's one of the characters in the Bible that there's probably more ink about him other than the Lord in the Bible. So we have a lot of data about his life. So we'll just continue where we were last week. So can't get away without this. So we're on our timeline here. So we're right in here in the United Kingdom. After doing all this study, it's kind of like, I don't know why we call it United. There were so many things going on that weren't unity. But we're talking about the life of David, which overlaps, of course, with Saul and Solomon. So we'll be covering that period. I'm just going to say just a couple of words about chronology. Chronology is really important. I think when you're looking at things in the Bible, and you look at David, and we're pretty fortunate that there's so much written in the Bible, in the 6 books especially, not counting Psalms, and it's pretty chronological. There are some epilogues, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but it's pretty chronological, and we know some things about David. We know that he lived for 70 years, and the only date that's tied to this is that on his 30th year, he became king of Judah. So I'm always wrestling with how do you pin these things together. So I spent a lot of time making timelines and trying to fit things in. It's pretty nerdy, actually. But there are some things, when it comes to the life of David, there's just some things. So we know 70 years, we know 30th birthday, and we have a date in history when Solomon started the temple. So there's in the Bible, it tells us when that happened. 480 years after the Israelites left Egypt. And in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, on the 2nd month, so forth. So it's pretty specific. And if we're pretty confident when that date was, with the Israelites leaving Egypt, even though we've talked about this in the past. There's a lot of controversy. Different scholars have different ideas. But when you pin that down, you can kind of pin down when this all took place. And so pretty much believe that David's reign in Judah started in 1010. Okay? Did I do the math right? No. Yes. Yes, I did. Aaron was making notes, and I said, I better make sure I'm right. So when you look at when you look at the chronology, there's several dates that we have some pretty good justification when those dates were. There's a couple tied to astronomical events and so forth. I'm not going to go into it, just to say it's when you start looking at these things and you start laying them out chronologically, to me, it makes the history kind of come alive. So we talked last week about some of the archaeology, and I just pointed out, that there is it's an area where David, right now in history, I mean, we have archaeology that mentions the house of David, which is probably the oldest reference to a character in the Bible, and that is on this Tel Dan Stela, which we talked about, which was discovered in the city of Dan, or what used to be Lachish. And so there's been a lot of excavation for many years in these areas. And this stela, and right here in this highlighted area, it says the house of David. Believe me, I can't read it, but I am told that's what it says. So that was a pretty significant find back in 1993 when this was discovered, because it was the first mention archaeologically of something that mentions David. We pulled out of the earth, and we know what time this happened based on other archaeological findings. We talked about that when you really get into this period of time, you really have to look at the six books, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, and there's a harmony in all of these. So we talked about that. So if you really want to study it, you have to look at all of those. And since David wrote about half the Psalms, a lot of the Psalms are also tied to some of these events. A lot to study if you really want to dig into it. We talked about these events in his early part of his life. I'm not going to go through them all, but starting with when Saul became king and David was born in Bethlehem and so forth. And he grew in his relationship with Saul, became a confidant, if you will, of the court. But Saul becomes jealous, chases him out, if you will, tries to kill him, basically, and starts his 7+ years of exile, traveling, trying to avoid Saul. I pointed out this map, and we went through these, where all the places he ran from Jerusalem up to Ramah and then to Nob, and he traveled around avoiding Saul. Now remember, Saul was not after him all the time, but he was after him a lot of the time because Saul was busy, fighting other people. So his life was pretty consumed. But this period kind of ends. Samuel dies about 10, 11, and the year after that, Saul dies. We talked about this in the past. So that kind of ended the exile. Actually, Saul stopped chasing him, and David was still fleeing for another year. But, okay. So here I'm going to cover some things that we did not talk about last week. And I thought, when I was going through this, I thought, man, there's so many things that are kind of interesting and tie things together. So one of them was number of David's wives and what happened. So, we know about Michal, Saul's daughter, who was in love with David, and he marries her, after Saul tells him he has to go kill a bunch of Philistines, bring back the foreskin and so forth, the dowry. But Saul is becoming very, very jealous of David at this time, sends him out on missions like go kill all these Philistines, kind of hoping he's going to get killed. Saul actually tries to kill him, threw a spear at him. So a lot goes on. During that time, he has befriended Jonathan, Saul's oldest son, and Jonathan and his sister, his wife, tell him, get out of here, flee. The king is trying to kill you. So he leaves and flees. Okay, so while he's gone, Saul marries her off to another guy. Okay, it's kind of important history. Just this stuff is happening. But during his exile, he picks up a few more wives.
Don't get him, Dave.
A lot of it is, it's kind of. Let's just look at this. So you have his first wife he's married to after. Is it his second first wife? Yeah. What?
Well, it just shows you Solomon following his father's footsteps, but did it.
Yeah. So we had Abigail, which is a really interesting story, because when David and his mighty men, his group were out hiding away in one area of the wilderness near Carmel, during a period of time, his men actually protected the shepherds and livestock keepers, if you will, of Nabal, who was a very rich Carmelite. And at the end of that time, when the harvest is right in the shearing, David sends some of his men saying, can you help us out here? And trying to say, we helped you. I don't think it was a protection racket, but I read something that said, well, it was just a protection racket. And he was like, we'll do all this stuff. Now you pay us, please. No, but he approached them in a proper and appropriate way of the time. And Nabal kind of shrugs him off. He's a rich and he's not a very nice guy. But his wife, who is a bright, beautiful, by the way, woman, in fact, the Bible mentions her and a few other very beautiful women in the Bible. And she takes it upon herself to help David's men out. So she does what her husband should have done in being more hospitable. And when she comes back home after delivering all these goodies with her people, her husband is drunk. He's been partying at the festival, and when he sobers up the next day, she tells him he has a heart attack and dies shortly thereafter. So Nabal is dead. So David, our little lustful man, takes her as his bride. Okay? And so she becomes his bride. And actually, when you look at her, she's almost like a prophet. She's somebody that counsels David quite a bit, and he listens to her more than, I think other than Bathsheba, she seems to have more influence on him than anybody else. So he also married a Jebusite. Okay, so Abigail has one son, Daniel, and the Jebusite, she has Ammon, who becomes very important. So he is the firstborn son, even though he's married to her, but this son is born first. So it's the firstborn son. Then you have Maacah, I'm not sure how you say her name, but she was the daughter of the king of Geshur, which is a little area just on the north end of the Sea of Galilee, a little kingdom. I'll show you a map a little later how this little kingdom was on its own. They weren't Israelites. And I'm not sure if she was part of, they would take spoils from, and I'm not sure if she was part of their conquests, or whether this was some kind of a political treaty kind of thing. Doesn't matter. But it's kind of interesting because this is the only non-Israelite. And so to be his wife, she had to go through a very strenuous process that's laid out in Deuteronomy. Shave her head, have you be able to, a lot of things before she could marry. So it's pretty interesting. He had three other wives, and Adonijah, whatever his name is, he will become the oldest living son at the end. So these are all wives that he acquired when in this 7 to 8 year period that he's in exile. Okay? Most of the children were probably born later in Hebron. But anyway, so it's just we didn't talk about this, but all these players become really important, later on. So it's kind of nice to know the background that, I don't know, it didn't really say why he acquired all these wives, but he also had 10 concubines.
Phil, in 1 Samuel 30, when they're in Ziklag and they come in and their wives and children are stolen.
Yes.
And David himself the Lord. It seems to me that David has children, or do you think it's just...
Yeah, some of them were born, but I mean, some of them were, I'm just pointing out, some of them they weren't all born while in exile. I mean,
because he had men who had children too, so it doesn't say specifically David's wives and children. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah. So there was a lot going on. And it's just important because these players become really important. So Absalom and Tamar, the daughter and son of Micaiah, whatever her name is, and they were very beautiful people, very attractive, which later they're going to become major players in our continuing story here. So after the exile, after he becomes king of Judah in part of his negotiations, he gets his first wife back. There's issues. They don't have children, needless to say. But Bathsheba enters the picture. We know the story of Bathsheba. How, during this time, David's at war with expanding his kingdom. And his men are out fighting, but he's at the palace. And he sees this beautiful woman bathing from his rooftop. He invites her over. So, needless to say, they have an affair. She becomes pregnant. David, in trying to make things right, but fix things, he brings her husband back, Uriah, from the battle. Uriah being one of the Hittite, one of David's mighty men, been with him a long time, and brings him back, trying to get him to sleep with his wife so the problem would be fixed. Uriah doesn't cooperate. He's too loyal. Anyway, so basically David arranges to have him killed. In battle. So Uriah's out of the picture. David marries her. Nathan the prophet enters. I'm kind of covering some stuff that we'll go over quick later, but Nathan the prophet comes into the picture and basically does a parable, kind of lays it on David. You've done wrong. God's not happy with you. Their first son dies. They then have a second son, Solomon. Okay? Now, there's another woman in the picture, but way at the end of the story. David is old, very old, and dying, and cannot be warm. He's always cold. So they get a young virgin to sleep with him. They didn't sleep biblically. She kept him warm. Anyway, she comes into the picture, not so much in our story, but when we get into Solomon, she becomes kind of another interesting player in that story. So these are the major women of his life. We don't know a lot about the concubines, even though they're in the picture, but we won't get into that. Okay. We're still in the review. So I took pictures of these, and I didn't do a very good job, and I'm sorry. But this is David's kingdom. So kind of started out here, and by conquest, they took on these areas. Right here in the middle is Geshur right here. That's a separate place, the Philistines, and up there, the Phoenicians are still their own people, but this is all David's kingdom. And I got another map here that just kind of overlays with today's, we're talking about 1948. So there is the country of Israel. You can see Israel does not have these areas. This is Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. But when David's time, he had quite a bit of territory east of the Jordan, east of the Dead Sea. Yes?
He was fulfilling what Joshua was supposed to do.
Yep.
He conquered most of it.
Yes. So he kind of fought the Philistines to a standstill, I think. But you can see here, this is the area. Here's the Gaza Strip, of course, and here's the West Bank, and here's the Golan Heights, all stuff today. Okay. Okay. I put this on just because this is a really good overview. So we have 70 years of David's life, starting about, we believe about 1040. And Saul reigned for about 40 years. David reigned for 40 years, but there's this period of time here when he first takes Judah. So all those things happen. David finally dies. So this is just a kind of a overview, which we will quickly go through things here. So Saul's death kind of triggered all this stuff. He had been fleeing. When Saul dies, he is asked to become the king of Judah. And he becomes the king of Judah. He's anointed to be that king in Hebron. But Saul had one son left, and there's factions at work here. This is why when you start looking at this and we talk about the United Kingdom and we think about when you see all the stuff that was going on, and they weren't too united. But so Saul's son becomes the king over Israel, what we will the northern 10 tribes. Yes.
Wasn't Abner basically running it through his...
Yeah, Abner who had been Saul's number one guy, is kind of orchestrating a lot of this stuff. He pretty much appears to be the power behind the throne. So, but it doesn't last too long. He's about two or so years, and they're basically at civil war. There's a civil war going on. There's factions that are still backing the Saul's dynasty, if you will, and a lot of people backing David. And we talked about last week, if David had not won, history would be a little different. He was the rebel. He's like in the American Revolution. He was the Americans who were fighting against the bad guys, and that's good if you win. And he did, of course, because God was behind him. But so there's this civil war going on, and it was just. But the king of Israel, his power is starting to slip. Abner, he's negotiating. He kind of starts aligning himself more with David, positioning himself. Yes.
Over the king of Israel getting on him for sleeping with one of Saul's.
Oh yeah, there was the scene with the concubines, and I'm not covering all. There's so much, but yeah, there's things going on here that are very interesting. Anyway, but the thing is, he kind of joins forces with David, and so he was Saul's leader. He was leader over here. David's general was Joab, and Joab was kind of a little out of favor. And anyway, he ends up killing Abner. So David mourns Abner. David mourns all these people because he was so loyal to Saul and the court, if you will. And so he definitely mourns Abner's death. And shortly thereafter, the king of Israel is done away with. So now we have David in position, and he is made the king of all Israel. It's important to realize that all is still not well. He has got a lot of enemies out there, people who do not like this. But David is now the king of all of Israel. He, at this time, goes up and they conquer Jerusalem. If you remember way back when we talked about this and how they had not captured everything, including Jerusalem, it was still controlled by the Jebusites. We finally take control of Jerusalem. And there's just a lot of stuff that's going on, a lot of battles going on. The ark is moving. Yes, Marie?
Sorry. How old was David by this time?
Well, he was 30 when he became king, so he's about in his about 40, early 40s, when a lot of this stuff has happened.
Okay.
Still a young man, still a pretty young
He's
man.
50, he's a kid.
What?
He's 50 years old, so he's a kid.
He's younger than the pastor at this time. Anyway, but God enters a covenant with David at this time. It tells him, we will build a nation. A king will always survive from your lineage. So it's just a lot of stuff going on. He is doing all these conquests. And we're going to come back to a little overlap here, but there's all these battles going on. So there's the outside enemies that he's fighting and taking control of things, and he's got a lot of inside enemies that are not happy with him. We'll talk just a little bit about that. But he puts together pretty good administration. They put things in place that are good. He at sometime during this time he finds his best friend Jonathan's son and brings him to the palace and makes him just a part of the family, and he belongs there. And so that is going on. Eventually they defeat the Ammonites and the Syrians, but meanwhile, back at the ranch, kind of going back to this during this conquest period, which is covered pretty extensively in 2 Samuel and Chronicles, but it's during this time that he encounters Bathsheba. So these things are all going on that I've talked about. So Bathsheba and Uriah enter the picture, and we talked about earlier how Nathan does a parable and really says, you're going to suffer, David, because you've done wrong. David confesses. David's a sinner, but he is always repentant, unlike Saul, let's say. So that's why he was a man after God's own heart. So their first son dies. God took him. And they have a second son, Solomon. Probably about the year 987, 86, right in that time, that happens. Okay, now we have Amnon and Tamar. Amnon, he was the firstborn son. Okay. Tamar and Absalom are brothers and sister. And Amnon lusts after his half-sister. The Bible actually says he loved her. I think he lusted after her. But he tricks her, and we won't go into all that. eventually rapes her, and yes,
It's really weird that even Dave's own kinmen helped
yes.
the rape of that.
Yeah, Amnon didn't do it all on his own. He had a friend that gave him the plan, how to accomplish this. And we won't go into that, but he rapes her. Absalom is furious. He eventually is going to kill Amnon. But there's about a 2-year period here. So after Amnon did this, he flees to Geshur, to his grandfather, who was the king. Remember his wife? She was the only non-Israelite. His mother, excuse me. So he flees and goes there, and he's there for a couple of years. But he's scheming and planning what he's going to do. He did murder, and then flees, I'm sorry. And he gets away and goes up to be with his grandfather. A couple of years go by, and he returns. Did I confuse that? I mean, yeah. He's furious, kills him, flees up here to another country, even though it's not very far away, 60 miles up the road. And after a time, he returns to Jerusalem. David forgives him, embraces his son, Absalom. He forgives him which seems pretty strange, but he loved his children, and anyway, so David forgives him, and Absalom is back in Jerusalem. Troubles start to brew now. Yes?
That David had control of his family and done something.
Yeah,
afterwards.
David's family was pretty dysfunctional family.
David was probably one of the leaders. Absalom wants to get revenge because he didn't do anything to protect the system.
Yeah. Well, in fact, when this happened, Absalom and his mother went to David and said, do something, and David decided not to do anything. So there was quite a bit of
I had a
animosity.
sermon that I preached a time or two, and when Nathan confronted David, before he knew the story was about him in the parable, David said he'll repay fourfold. Okay? So he almost brought his own judgment because the baby died, Tamar was raped, Amnon died, and Absalom died. So all 4 of his children suffered negative, and that was what his own judgment was in the story that was told him. So
Right. So
it's a fourfold judgment.
there's a lot of things going on here. So David's family is very dysfunctional. I think about it as a father, as a grandfather, great grandfather. I think about, was David a really good father? I mean, he loved his children, but I'm not. What, Aaron?
But he was an absentee father because he was fighting and conquering.
Yeah. Anyway, so, but troubles start to brew here, and I better watch my time here. Better quickly go through this. So Absalom is he is a very attractive man. Looks like a king, like Saul. Looks like a king. The people like him. I think there were people who thought, it's good he took revenge for his sister, but he was gaining, and he connived and schemed and gained favor, maybe undermined David whenever possible, but he got a lot of favor, and he started growing in power within the nation of Israel. So there are just a number of things that I won't go into, but it gets so bad that David flees for his life, and he leaves Jerusalem. Yes?
Thanks to Absalom got help from Bathsheba's grandfather.
Yes. So, yeah, Absalom was getting advice from several people, including Bathsheba's grandfather. And so all these things are going on. David escapes. There's just a lot of stuff going on. People helping different sides, and things are going back and forth. And Absalom is basically taking control of things. But eventually, Absalom is killed. Let's see, he got his head stuck in a tree, or his hair got stuck in a tree, but then Joab took care of things with a couple of spears. So Joab actually kills him. Not good.
No, he was told not to get my food.
So David, Joab is his number one guy, his number one general, but he kills his son, David's loyalty, son.
He killed Abner too. So
Yeah. So there's just a lot of killing going on. When David finds out that Absalom's dead, he mourns. He mourns every time one of the people are killed. Let's see. I don't want to cover all these things because there was just a lot of things that were going on during that time. And if you read this stuff, the rebellion of Sheba, and these are factions within the country that are vying for power. There are people who want him gone. They want the house of Saul to be back in charge. So, we call this the United Kingdom. I think this period of time is pretty undivided. But eventually, after Absalom dies, eventually his oldest son, David, is very sick. He's near death. His oldest son kind of decides he is the heir apparent and moves to become king. Bathsheba and Nathan go to David, plead with him that this is right, that Saul was the anointed one, and get David to anoint Solomon king. And that takes place, and Solomon becomes king. David imparts wisdom on this the last year or so of his life. And finally, David dies. So I just want to point one thing out. So when you're looking at this, remember when we talked about Judges in the last few chapters of Judges? It's kind of an epilogue. It isn't chronological. They throw these additional things out, little stories here. Well, the same thing takes place in 2 Samuel. So the last few chapters, they're talking about events. Edomites, no, I can't remember. Anyway, oh yes, Gibeonites, and things that there's just different things that are talked about that are not chronological. Those things did not happen right at the end. They were things that happened during his life.
you're like giving a summary, like, well,
Yeah. So I don't need to. So by the time David dies, Solomon, has all this territory, and Solomon. And when we get ready to talk about Solomon, you'll see Solomon expands the kingdom. And I think it's kind of interesting that we talk about this kingdom, but relative to other powers that have happened in history, Israelites, it's pretty small. Compared to the Babylonians and Persians and the Romans, it's really pretty small footprint.
And thanks to David,
But-
a lot of the stuff that Solomon needed for the temple was already.
Yeah. So during this time, David had prepared for the temple. God told him he can't build a temple. His son will build a temple. There's just a lot of things that are going on. Okay. In conclusion, what do I want to say here? I just put down some thoughts here. But so I think when you look at David's character, I mean, he's faithful, he's loyal, he's brave, he's passionate, he's worshipful, he's lustful, but remorseful. He's a man after God's own heart. He predicts the Messiah is going to come and is going to sit at the right hand of God. So I mean, David's very prophetic. Did I cover that? Oh, yes, I did that. Whoop. Some challenges that he had during his life. Certainly, challenge of the Philistines, the giant, when he was young. Later he has to deal with Saul, but he's loyal, but Saul's trying to kill him. That's pretty challenging. Adultery with Bathsheba and all the things involved there, probably maybe his biggest sin. Adultery and killing the husband. But, definitely. And he had, like we said, he had a really dysfunctional family. There was just a lot of things going on there. So he had to manage that dysfunction. But he had, strength comes from God with faith, and God created all the people. So he desired worship. God forgives the sin and redeems any situation. So these are things that we learn from how David handled all this dysfunction. Okay, so anybody have any questions? Terry?
It's just weird how he has the 8 wives and 10 concubines, and Solomon, seeing what his father did, just had to go and 700 wives.
Yeah, I can't even imagine 700 wives. I had trouble managing one. Yeah.
Why, the Jewish people, they're not supposed to have more than one wife, aren't they? I mean, back then.
I wanted everybody to have one.
I mean, God's plan is one man, one woman, but seems to be fairly common with people in power. And like I say, some of David's wives, we don't know. We don't know if those were strategic things, but certainly, it certainly wasn't. It was.
He could have married them to his men or to his,
Yeah. So
he had how many brothers? So.
David had seven brothers. Yeah. So anything else? Well, thank you. Let's close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this time together. I know there's just a lot of stuff, but I really encourage you to take the time to look at this period of history, read